A dog sits beside a grave, refusing to leave. Day and night, through the scorching sun and heavy rain, it stays there, barking, whining, scratching at the dirt. The villagers think it's mourning its owner, until someone realizes the grave doesn't belong to the dog's owner at all. And when the police finally decide to dig it up, what they find inside leaves them frozen in fear. What secret was buried in that grave? And why was this dog the only one who knew? Animals have a sense of loyalty that humans can only dream of, but sometimes they sense things we can't even comprehend. This story isn't just about a dog's loyalty. It's about an unexplainable mystery, a terrifying discovery, and a shocking truth that would have remained buried forever if not for one persistent dog. Stay with me as we uncover the eerie truth behind the grave that no one wanted to open. It all started in a small, quiet village tucked away from the chaos of the modern world. Life moved at its own slow pace here. People knew each other by name. Doors were left unlocked, and gossip spread faster than the morning mist. It was a place where nothing unusual ever happened, until one day something did. At the very edge of the village, beyond the last row of houses, stood an old, forgotten graveyard. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, overgrown with wild grass and dotted with crumbling headstones. No one visited it anymore, not because of superstition, but simply because the people buried there had long been forgotten. Their families had either moved away or passed on, leaving the resting place abandoned and silent. That silence was broken one evening when the villagers noticed a dog sitting by one of the graves. At first, it didn't seem like much. The dog was a stray, thin and covered in dust, its fur matted from years of living on the streets. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in the village, and many people assumed it had simply found a cool place to rest under the shade of the tombstone. But as days passed, it became clear this wasn't just any dog, and this wasn't just any grave. The dog refused to leave. Day after day, it sat there, staring at the dirt beneath its paws. When someone approached, it would lift its head, eyes filled with an eerie mixture of sorrow and determination. Then it would go back to what it had been doing, scratching at the ground, whining softly, its ears twitching at the slightest sound. At first, the villagers pitied it. They assumed it was mourning its owner, as dogs often did when their beloved humans passed away. Some people tossed it scraps of food, but the dog barely touched them. It wasn't hunger that kept it there. It was something else, something deeper, something unsettling. Then, an old woman named Amira, who had lived in the village for over 80 years, decided to take a closer look. She walked to the grave one morning, her cane tapping against the stones as she approached. The dog didn't growl or run. It simply looked at her, then back at the grave. Curious, Amira brushed away the dried leaves that had gathered around the tombstone. The writing on the stone was faded, worn away by decades of rain and wind. Squinting, she traced her fingers over the barely visible letters, mumbling the name under her breath. And then she froze. The name, it wasn't familiar. In all her years in the village, she had never heard of this person. She strained her memory, trying to recall if they had been someone from a neighboring town, someone who had passed through long ago. But nothing came to her. Whoever was buried here was a complete stranger. A chill ran down her spine. She turned back to the villagers who had gathered nearby. "Who remembers this grave?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. Silence. One by one, people shook their heads. No one knew who it belonged to. No one had ever seen anyone visit it. Not in years, not in decades. The realization hit them all at once. The dog wasn't mourning its owner, because this wasn't its owner's grave at all. So why was it so desperate to stay? The unease in the village grew. People began whispering about the dog, about the grave, about what it could possibly mean. Some dismissed it as mere coincidence. Dogs are strange creatures, one man said, trying to wave away the growing tension. Maybe it just likes the spot, but others weren't so sure. A few villagers claimed they had heard the dog barking late into the night, a sharp, desperate sound that sent shivers down their spines. One man swore he had seen the dog digging furiously at the dirt, its paws raw and bleeding, as if trying to uncover something buried deep below. Then, things got stranger. A young boy, no older than 10, came running home one evening, his face pale as a sheet. He had been playing near the graveyard when he saw something he couldn't explain. "The ground moved," he stammered, clutching his mother's arm. "I saw it move." His mother scolded him for making up stories, but the boy insisted. It was like something was pushing up from underneath. The villagers didn't know what to think. Some laughed nervously, dismissing the child's story as an overactive imagination, but others exchanged uneasy glances. the dog, the grave, the strange noises at night. It was all starting to feel too much like a warning. And then came the night when the dog's howls woke up the entire village. It was long past midnight when the first screams echoed through the streets. The dog wasn't just barking, it was wailing, a gut-wrenching, bone-chilling sound that seemed almost human. People peeked out of their windows, their hearts pounding. The dog stood at the grave, its body rigid, its fur standing on end. It barked wildly at the dirt, growling, snapping at the air as if trying to bite something unseen. Its eyes, usually filled with sorrow, now burned with something else, fear, pure raw fear. No one slept that night. By morning, the villagers knew something had to be done. The whispers turned into demands. Someone needed to dig up that grave. Whatever was going on, whatever the dog was trying to tell them, they had to find out. But who would do it? Superstition ran deep in the village. Digging up a grave without cause was seen as a terrible omen, a disruption of the dead's eternal rest. No one wanted to be the one to disturb it. That was when the mayor decided to call the police. At first, the officers were skeptical. "It's just a dog," they said, shaking their heads. Animals act strange sometimes, but when they arrived and saw the dog, its exhausted body, its trembling legs, its unwavering gaze fixed on the grave, they hesitated. Something was wrong, very wrong. One of the officers tapped his foot on the dirt. A hollow sound echoed back. Graves weren't supposed to sound like that. The unease spread like wildfire. People gathered in silence, their breaths held as the officers grabbed their shovels. The dog took a step back, its tail low, its ears pinned, but it didn't leave. It just watched, as if it already knew what they were about to find. Days turned into weeks. The dog refused to move. The villagers grew uneasy. The once dismissed presence of the stray had now become the center of whispered conversations, exchanged glances, and growing fear. At first, they thought it was just an abandoned pet, grieving the loss of an owner who might never return. But the more they observed, the more they realized the dog wasn't mourning, it was guarding. There was a difference. An elderly man, who had lived in the village for decades, swore he had seen something like this before. "Dogs don't act like this without reason," he warned. His voice trembled with an urgency that was lost on the younger villagers. "There's something wrong with that grave." Most brushed him off as just an old man telling ghost stories. After all, what could a dog know that they didn't? But the dog's behavior only became more bizarre. It stopped barking. It stopped begging. Instead, it simply sat there, staring at the grave, as if waiting for something. It barely moved, except for the occasional shiver that ran through its body, as if the very air around it had turned cold. The dog's ribs became more visible, yet it refused to leave. Hunger no longer seemed to matter to it. One night, a woman returning home from a neighbor's house hurried past the graveyard. She didn't want to look, but something made her glance toward the dog. It was still there, its eyes locked on the gravestone. The moonlight bathed the entire scene in an eerie glow, and just as she was about to turn away, she heard it, scraping sounds. At first, she thought it was the wind rustling through the dry leaves. But no, the sound was coming from below, not from the dog, not from the surrounding trees, from beneath the ground. Her breath hitched in her throat, and her legs turned to stone. She wanted to scream, but fear held her voice captive. The noise was faint, but distinct, like something clawing at the wood of a coffin. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her. For one long, agonizing moment, she stood frozen in place, her ears straining to catch another sound. Then, the dog let out a low, guttural growl. That was enough to snap her out of her trance. She bolted, her heart hammering against her ribs as she ran straight to her home. She slammed the door shut, locked it, and collapsed onto the floor, panting. That night, she told no one what she had heard, but the fear in her eyes the next morning was unmistakable. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the grave belonged to a man who had died under mysterious circumstances. Others whispered that it was cursed, that the soil had never truly accepted the body buried within it. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain. No one wanted to go near it, except for the dog. The villagers grew anxious. Children were warned to stay away from the graveyard. People walked faster when passing by. Even those who had never believed in superstitions found themselves making small prayers under their breath whenever they spoke of the grave. And still, the dog remained. By the third week, its fur had grown dull, its body weaker. The once vibrant animal now looked like a ghost of itself, but its resolve never wavered. The only time it moved was when it dug, frantically, desperately, as if it had to reach something buried beneath the dirt. Then, one morning, the dog did something different. Instead of digging, Instead of barking, it laid down on the grave and let out a long, mournful howl, a sound that made the villagers' blood run cold. A cry of sorrow, a cry of warning. That was the final straw. The villagers decided enough was enough. The fear that had simmered for weeks boiled over. Some demanded answers. Others wanted the dog removed. But a few, particularly the elderly man who had first voiced his concern, insisted that they call the police. The authorities were skeptical at first. A stray dog refusing to leave a grave? It sounded like superstition. But after hearing the villagers' trembling voices, after seeing the state of the dog, they reluctantly agreed to investigate. When the officers arrived, they approached the grave cautiously. The dog, as if sensing their intention, stood up and took a few shaky steps back. Its sunken eyes stayed fixed on them as they examined the tombstone. Everything seemed normal until one of the officers knelt down and pressed a hand against the earth. The ground was uneven, softer in some places, disturbed. A chill ran down his spine. Another officer tapped his colleague on the shoulder and nodded toward something, a deep scratch on the gravestone, as if someone had clawed at it from inside. The lead officer hesitated. Then, in a firm voice, he ordered the grave to be opened. The villagers gathered around, watching in horrified silence as shovels pierced the ground. The digging started slow, but as more unsettling details emerged, the looseness of the soil, the strange odor, urgency took over. The deeper they dug, the more the tension thickened. The dog stood at the edge, its breathing shallow, its body trembling. Then suddenly, it whimpered and turned its head away. The moment the shovel hit something solid, the digging stopped. The wooden lid of the coffin was exposed. The officer took a deep breath and reached for the latch. Then he lifted it open, and in that instant everything changed. What they found inside left them paralyzed with fear. The officers stood frozen, their breath caught in their throats. The lanterns around them flickered, casting eerie shadows on the freshly dug grave. The entire village, standing at a distance, watched in horrified silence. The dog, the one that had refused to leave this very spot, whimpered and growled, its body tense, as if guarding a dark secret. It had led them here for a reason, and now, as the officers pried open the wooden lid, that reason was staring back at them. Inside the coffin lay two bodies, one skeletal, clothed in rotting fabric, its identity long lost to time. The other was fresh, too fresh, a woman, her face pale, lips slightly parted, eyes forever frozen in an expression of terror. Dirt clung to her skin, under her nails, as if she had struggled, clawing at the coffin's lid from the inside. The realization hit the officers all at once. This woman had been buried alive. The villagers gasped in unison. Someone let out a choked cry. An older woman gripped her chest and staggered back. A few of the children clutched their mothers, shielding their faces, sensing the horror even if they didn't fully understand it. The officers recoiled at the smell, a mix of damp earth, something metallic, and an unmistakable stench of death. But there was something else, something more disturbing than anything they had ever encountered. The dog whimpered louder now, pawing at the ground, its eyes darting between the coffin and the villagers. It was as if it was trying to tell them something. One officer, his hand shaking, shone his flashlight inside, and that's when they saw it. The woman's wrists were bound with an old, frayed rope. Her ankles, too. Bruises covered her arms and neck. But the most horrifying part, her fingers were bent, twisted unnaturally, as if she had spent her last moments desperately trying to escape, trying to claw her way out before the oxygen ran out. The lead officer turned to the villagers, his voice hoarse. "Who is she?" A murmur spread through the crowd, whispers, gasps, and then finally, a young man hesitantly stepped forward. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. She's Layla." Silence. Even the wind seemed to have died. The name sent a ripple of shock through the village. Layla, the woman who had disappeared 2 weeks ago without a trace. Her family had searched for her. Posters were put up, search parties formed, but no one had found a single clue. Until now, the officers exchanged tense glances. Who buried her? The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. No one answered. Then a voice, low, trembling. "This grave, it belonged to Malik Saab's son." Another wave of murmurs. Eyes darted towards an old man, standing at the back of the crowd. Malik Saab, the wealthiest man in the village. His son had died years ago. Some said of illness. Others whispered darker rumors. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that someone had buried Layla here, and whoever had done it had hoped she'd never be found. The officers wasted no time. "We need to question everyone," one of them barked. "This isn't just a case of a missing person. This is murder." But even as they spoke, the dog remained fixated on something else. It barked, not at the grave, not at the officers, but at the villagers, at someone within the crowd. A man in his late 40s, dressed in simple clothes, his face glistening with sweat despite the cold night air. He took a step back, then another. The dog snarled, its fur bristled, and then it lunged. The man screamed, stumbling as the dog's teeth sank into his pant leg. He thrashed, trying to shake it off, but the dog refused to let go. The officers acted fast, restraining the man. As the villagers stared in shock, the lead officer grabbed him by the collar. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "What happened to Layla?" The man trembled, his lips quivered, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed. "I buried her," he croaked. She found out the truth. About Malik Sahib, about his son's death. He couldn't let her live. Gasps. Some villagers covered their mouths in horror. The officers wasted no time. They radioed for backup. Malik Sahib was taken in for questioning that night, and the full truth unraveled soon after. He had been hiding something dark, something he never thought would resurface. But he hadn't counted on one thing: a stray dog, a loyal creature that refused to let its friend be forgotten. As the officers led the guilty men away, the dog sat beside the grave once more. It let out a long, mournful howl. Then, as if its duty was done, it stood up and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The village would never be the same again. The village erupted into chaos. The police launched an investigation, and soon, the horrifying truth unraveled. The second body belonged to a missing person, someone who had disappeared months ago, someone the villagers had assumed had left on their own. But in reality, they had been murdered and buried in an old grave to hide the crime. And the dog, it had been the only one to notice. No one knew if the victim had once been kind to the stray, if they had fed it, or if the dog had just sensed something was terribly wrong. But one thing was clear: without this dog, the crime might never have been uncovered. As the police cordoned off the area, the village found itself divided between fear and admiration. Some whispered that the dog was no ordinary stray. Others claimed it had been guided by a force beyond human understanding. How else could it have known where to dig? How else could it have sensed what no one else did? Over the following days, forensic teams arrived, and the graveyard became an active crime scene. The older villagers, who had seen generations pass, huddled together, recounting old tales of spirits that never found peace. Maybe the soul of the buried man reached out to the dog. One elder murmured, maybe it needed justice, but the truth was much simpler. The dog had never wavered. It had never given up. The victim's identity was soon confirmed: a local shopkeeper who had mysteriously vanished. His disappearance had been an unsolved case, one the authorities had reluctantly closed due to lack of evidence. His family had mourned his absence, but eventually moved on, believing he had run away for reasons unknown. But now, the grim reality was undeniable. He had never left the village. He had been murdered in cold blood and buried in the very ground people walked over every day. The revelation sent shockwaves through the village. Who could have done this? And more importantly, why? The answer came quicker than expected. Investigators, now armed with new evidence, traced the murder back to a local man, a neighbor of the victim. He had owed the shopkeeper a substantial amount of money and, unable to repay his debt, had chosen the darkest path possible. He had lured the victim to an isolated location, taken his life, and buried him in an unmarked grave, hoping time would erase the crime. But time hadn't erased it. A dog had remembered. When the suspect was confronted, he broke down. The weight of the crime had never left him, but he had believed he was safe. No witnesses, no evidence. No one would ever know. But he hadn't counted on the stray. He hadn't counted on its persistence, its unwavering dedication to uncovering the truth. With his confession, justice was finally served. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the unease lingered. How had they ignored the signs? How had they dismissed the victim's disappearance so easily? The stray, now a local hero, was given a name. Sean, meaning pride. Offers poured in from villagers who wanted to adopt him, but it was one of the officers who had dug up the grave who ultimately took him home. And yet, even after finding a warm bed and food, Sean never truly left the graveyard. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he would return to the very spot where he had dug so tirelessly. He would sit in silence, staring at the grave as if still keeping watch. Was it out of habit? Or did he know something the rest of them never could? Some believed he was waiting for a final farewell, a sign that the victim had finally found peace. Others, more skeptical, dismissed it as mere routine. But deep down, everyone knew this was no ordinary dog. As time passed, the village moved on. The grave was given a proper headstone, flowers were placed, and prayers were said. The victim's family found solace in knowing the truth, painful as it was. And Sean, he remained a guardian of the forgotten, a reminder that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Perhaps the world didn't deserve a dog like him, but for that village, in that moment, he was exactly what they needed. If you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe for more incredible animal stories like this one.